The name of this lecture is The Pre-Socratics and Their Questions. And I love the Pre-Socratics, and I hope you do too. The Pre-Socratics, the early ones anyway, were monists. And these guys were creative as can be. Imagine thinking that everything you see is ultimately one thing. What a thought to have. And the first philosopher that seems to have had that thought is Thales, who lived from 625 to 547 BC. So this is well in advance of the Persian Wars, right? Thales, we have a few little fragments from him. Seems to have said that all is water. Now I've read these fragments. He says some other things as well, but to get into all of these kind of minutiae about Thales and what he might have said is beyond what we're going to talk about today. This is very introductory. But Thales did say that all is water, which means that the variegated experience that we have of the multiplicity of things finally is a manifestation of one thing. Now, there's much speculation as to why it's water, but if you think about water, right? Think about water. There, water. Well, water, when it gets hard, it's a solid, right? So it can turn from liquid to solid, or it can evaporate and become air, right? So water can seem to become air, and the other way it seems to get solid like earth. So maybe Thales thought that everything was water because water could finally become other things and still be itself. We don't know. We do know that Anaximander, shortly afterward, claimed that everything is made up of the boundless. Aperon, the boundless. Everything is but a limit of the boundless. So what one has is the unlimited, right? And the unlimited gets limited, and as the unlimited gets limited, it becomes a definite thing. Now this guy has always really excited me. I mean, the unlimited becoming limited. I mean, we've got a guy here, you know, he's living in the early 6th century BC, thinking these things, actually late 6th century BC. Anaximander. Perhaps this is a way of getting around some of the arguments against everything is made of water, because now everything becomes a more abstract thing. Who knows exactly? We call these philosophers sometimes Malaysians. Malaysian philosophers. Anaximenes came later, 585 to 528 BC. Notice, because this is a course called Faith, Reason, Knowledge in a Christian seminary, you can use the word BC. Now, what about all these seminaries that changed to BCE, before the Common Era? Well, we're going to go before Christ. That's traditional. That's what we're using. So anyway, he said that everything is made of air. Now, why did he say that everything was made of air when Anaximander seemed to have gotten this maximum abstraction by saying that everything is made of the boundless? Well, we're not sure why he said this, but it may be that now air seems, at least it's concrete enough to be something. The boundless isn't anything at all, because everything we see is not the boundless. At least air is kind of like the boundless, and it's still a thing, maybe. Who knows? The next person we want to talk about is Heraclitus. Heraclitus, you see it on the slide, 535 to 475 BC. So he was actually alive during the Persian Wars. And Heraclitus is known to have said that all is made of fire. But what he really meant here was that everything is in flux, right? Everything is in flux. All things change. He said that man cannot step into the same river twice, right? Because when you step into the river, it's going to have different water there. So when you stepped in it the first time, it has different water than when you step in it the second time. So it's not the same river. Now, of course, philosophers, when they start to think about this, start to hatch ideas about what are the identity conditions of rivers, you know. Heraclitus certainly thought that part of the identity condition of a river was its materiality. It can't be the same river if it has different matter. There's different water there, right? Now, we also have from Heraclitus a mention of what's a very important notion in Greek philosophy called the logos. Logos. In Greek philosophy, logos comes to mean a lot of things, really. But for Heraclitus, the logos is an ordering principle. Okay? So the flux, fire, is ordered in a certain way, and this ordering and regularities that are established within the flux gives us the world that we experience. So you take flux and you add the ordering principle and you get the world. Now, some of you know that this word logos has a long history. It became very important in Stoic philosophy. And of course, logos means order, reason. It gets identified later on with other notions, but reason and word go right together. And of course, in the prologue to the Gospel of John, we have in the beginning was the Word. That is the logos. And anybody that read the prologue to the Gospel of John or heard the statement, in the beginning was the Word, and in the beginning was the logos, would have understood these connotations that we now miss to a great degree. Well, I don't have the Pythagoreans on this slide. I did talk about it in a previous slide. But of course, the Pythagoreans thought that all things were made of number. And they thought that there were an infinite number of numbers on a line. And Parmenides, we don't have good dates on Parmenides, but he was a very important figure, claimed against the Pythagoreans that there couldn't be an infinite number of points on a line. And his student Zeno, who lived from 490 to 430, even had some paradoxes here. If there were an infinite number of points between here and here, right, I would have to, in order to get there, I'd have to go halfway, right? But then in order for me to get there to there, I'd have to go halfway. If there's an infinite number of points, I can never get there, right? Because I'd always have to go halfway there. And there's always more points. Well, if that works between here and there, it also works between here and here, right? So really, you can never get anywhere. Now, we could draw all this up nicely and formally, as philosophers are prone to do, and what I might do in a different class. But at this point, that's all that I need to mention to you, is that the Parmenidean school certainly held that the Pythagoreans were wrong on their belief that everything is made up of number. The Pythagoreans were pluralists here, right? Claiming that there are lots of different numbers. And the Parmenideans, Parmenides and his followers, claimed that there's only one thing. So they were the opposite of the pluralists. And again, they espoused a monism, sometimes called the Eleatic school. Monism. Everything is made of one thing. Parmenides also certainly argued against Heraclitus. Heraclitus says that everything is made of flux, right? Everything's in motion. And Parmenides says, well, if this is the case, one could never know anything, right? Because everything would be changing. It's just impossible that everything could be changing. We wouldn't have any knowledge, and there would not be any stability. So he wasn't very excited about how Heraclitus tried to use the notion of logos here to make the point that the world could be comprised of flux, logalized, logosized. Parmenides says that everything is one, an undifferentiated one. Now, if you think of a perfect one, it is just one, right? There are no parts to one. Okay, so everything that ultimately is one. There are no parts to it, and the parts that we seem to see is appearance rather than reality. Parmenides claimed there was no non-being, right? Because were there to be non-being, or in order for there to be non-being, one would have to say there is non-being. But to say there is non-being means that the non-being already is, you see. So there could be no non-being, because the necessary condition for saying that there's non-being is to claim that it is. So all there is being. There is oneness. It has being. And there are other things we can say about Parmenides, maybe the earliest exponent of one who would claim an identity of being and thinking, but we're not going to go into that at this point. At this point, we just want to point out that whereas the Pythagoreans were pluralists, Parmenides and his followers were monists. Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Heraclitus were monists too. However, we would have to talk about different senses of monism here, and one could say that one was a monist with regard to attributes. An attribute monist, there is only one kind of attribute, but an attribute monist could be a pluralist with respect to the number of instantiations of that attribute. An absolute monist would say that there's only one thing, and this clearly was what Parmenides held. Our next pre-Socratic philosopher takes us out of the world of monism into the world of pluralism. He's an attribute pluralist and a pluralist. He claimed that all things were comprised of four roots. Now, if you remember, we've already had water. Thales talked about everything's made of water. Okay, well, that's a good one. Anaximenes, everything's made of air. Oh, that sounds good. Heraclitus, everything made of fire. Well, that's a good one. But we see earth all around us. Xenophanes, which I didn't talk about, said in one obscure comment that everything is made of earth. Well, maybe Empedocles heard that. Maybe it was the philosophical opinion of the time, a consensus that was coming to fruition by this time. But for whatever reasons, Empedocles says that everything is made of these four things: earth, air, fire, and water. Now, when you think of things like sheep manure, it's kind of hard to see how everything is made of these four things and how it can be that everything is actually these four things. Not sure how that works, but this is what Empedocles holds. And indeed, we only, again, I keep saying this, but we only have fragments of these guys, and unless one wants to spend one's life being a pre-Socratic specialist. We can only generalize to a certain extent about what people have said about these guys in consonancy with the material, the scant material we do have. A man that was born before Empedocles, but who died after Empedocles, was a guy by the name of Anaxagoras, who Plato said he was excited about reading until he read him and then found out that he didn't get to where Plato wanted him to be. Anaxagoras said that everything is made of everything, which that's a pretty radically plural view, right? Everything is made of everything. So over here we have an oak tree. There is an oak tree root, I suppose, and a wool root, a water root, perhaps a mastodon root, right? And a mastodon, which of course were extinct by this time, if there's a mastodon there, it would have more mastodon roots present than it would have wool roots, right? Or sheep manure roots. Well, okay, that seems absurd at this point. It's almost like it's taken, if you want to read the pre-Socratics in one way, it's reduced to absurdity, the notion of the question. But of course, Anaxagoras is more subtle than that, and he has reasons for his views. He did also talk about something that became very important in Greek philosophy, the notion of nous as mind. And of course, Plato loved to talk about this, and Greek philosophy after this time spends a great deal of time reflecting on nous and soul and these kinds of notions. However, Anaxagoras' view of nous really seemed to be more like a natural phenomenon. It was mind in a sense, but it was part of nature, and it did not escape the naturalism, if you will, of all of these thinkers. Now notice one word I haven't talked about here is God. Well, I mean, these guys talk about the gods occasionally, but they certainly don't talk about a creative God, a transcendent God. These guys are all monists who believe that somehow a sufficient explanation of the world is found by finding the one thing to which everything can be ultimately reduced. And of course, here we come to a real philosophical question. What is a sufficient explanation for the world? You know, there are those who will say that they've found a sufficient explanation of the world if they find out the one thing that all things are comprised of. Or maybe they can say, well, we have a sufficient explanation of the world if the macroevolutionary hypothesis back to the Big Bang is a consistent story, supportable by the facts as we know them, if you will. But of course, other minds will want to say things like, yeah, but what caused the Big Bang? And the first type of philosophical sentiment might say, well, that's a senseless question. What do you mean, what caused the Big Bang? That's silly. You're confused to even ask the question. But the other person might say, well, no, that's a legitimate question. What caused the Big Bang? What do you mean? I can make all kinds of sense out of that question. A child asks that question. The first one might say, well, but the child's confused in asking the question, right? So, what are the reasons for things? And what criteria do we employ to sort the legitimate reasons for things over and against the illegitimate reasons for things? It amazes me in our current age of naturalism how people who are naturalist persuasion will just claim that somebody's muddle-headed if they want to ask the question, well, what is the reason for nature? What is the nature? What is the reason for nature? Why is there being and not nothing? Well, of course, the degree to which naturalists find this to be an illegitimate question has much less to do with clarity of philosophical thinking and much more to do with what's fashionable, right? It's very fashionable to claim now that naturalism is the way things are, and that brute fact is an explanation of itself. But, of course, in the philosophical tradition and in the theological tradition, this has never been the way things have been. Cicero, the Roman philosopher, once said that the study of history allows us to escape the tyranny of the present. And if the study of philosophy does anything, it should teach you that there are questions that are legitimate that the greatest minds who ever lived have thought about. And just because the guy in the biology department at the community college thinks it's illegitimate might not mean that it is, right? It may be that the greatest minds that ever lived were thinking about questions that are the deepest questions that we've forgotten to ask, forgotten how to think. The great questions given to us, bequeathed to us by the Greeks. First one, the question of the one and many. There are many things, and are these many things somehow reducible to one thing? How about anything? Anything that is in some sense many things. I go out and I look at a tree. Well, that tree is one thing, but it's also many things. It's a trunk, it's branches, it's leaves, it's roots, right? Or how about a twig itself? A twig is many things as well. How do we sort the many into the one? When does the one cease to be and become a many? Famous in the ancient world was this notion of the ship that goes out into the Mediterranean Sea, right? And a storm comes and the ship starts to come apart. When does that ship that is starting to come apart become a heap of many things and no longer the ship? When exactly does that happen? When the mast falls off? When the steering wheel goes away? When the rudder falls off? When the deck boards come out? It's a very major question in philosophy. What is the criterion of identity of a thing? Another question, change. If you think about it, change is only possible if there is one thing that doesn't change that changes. What are you saying, Bielfeldt? Well, think about Heraclitus' world. Everything's in motion. Okay. We could say that everything changes, I suppose we could say that, but if you're thinking about any particular thing, it doesn't really change. It goes away and another thing takes its place. If a human being is just that which constantly changes, then there's no criterion by which to identify that the same human being perdures throughout these temporal slices. And indeed, we have philosophers now who would claim that it's a fiction to believe that human beings are unity. They are just a accidental unity or a batch of temporal slices. And their mental life is a batch of experiences. And there's no, as Kant would say, transcendental unity of apperception. There's nothing there that remains the same in the changes. The great English philosopher David Hume, who died in 1776, claimed that the self has no identity in the way that previous philosophers had thought, and he compared it to being at a theater. Our mental life is just various images on the stage, right? And there's nothing there that brings together these various experiences as the experience had by one thing. But of course, this idea becomes very problematic, because when you think about it, a succession of awarenesses presupposes an awareness of the succession of awarenesses. And there's Kant's critique of Hume. And I've always liked the Germans. They're good philosophers, right? So, I mean, for the Greeks, in order to know something, it had to have some being, and if you know that it changes, there has to be something there that changes. And of course, with Aristotle, then we get the wonderful metaphysics of a substance, a primary substance that undergoes change, right? It remains what it is, but it has accidental modifications. Another great question, the question of relativism and knowledge. What can I know? What could be known in a Heraclitean universe? Well, it seems like it's just a bunch of flux, you know? I can't know anything definite. In fact, I can't say anything about the river because it's not the same river. Every time I try to use the word, I'm talking about a different thing. So I need a word for each and every bit of experience there ever was. Man, that would be complicated to say anything. So we're going to see with Plato and developments afterwards that knowledge can't just be about this material flux that's passing away. It has to be about something stable. And finally, of course, one of the great questions is the question of being in a changing universe itself. Just as we can ask the question of what is the identity of the thing changing, what is the oneness in the change, the identity and difference, as Hegel would talk about it. What is being in a changing universe? That is, what is the being of being? One can be in different ways. Things are in different ways. Is there a unity of being in the different ways that being is being what being is being? And if you're thinking at this point like the guy looking at the box, scratching your head, well, then perhaps the lecture has been useful. So we are going to come back and talk about Socrates and Plato in the next lecture. Thank you.